We do this through our free and subsidized carrier screening programs, which are funded entirely by the generous donations um, of people involved with our charity and supported by various educational and fundraising events. Tonight's lecture will be given by Professor Sander L. Gilman. Professor Gilman is a cultural historian of science, medicine, and Jewish studies, and Professor Emeritus at Emory University. He has written over 100 books, including most recently Doc or Quack, Science and Anti-Science in Modern Medicine, which was published last year. His talk tonight will explore the complex relationship between Jewish identity and modern medicine, from the 19th century to today. I'll now pass it over to Professor Gilman to begin his talk.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you all for coming today. Let me begin by saying that I'm flattered to have this audience because for the last almost 50 years, I have been arguing vociferously against the notion that there are quote unquote Jewish diseases. And for just as long almost, I have been advocating for universal genetic screening of newborns. So this context for me brings both of those things together, the question of the need for genetic testing and for, I think, a very real contemporary anxiety about the notion of lumping and thinking about disease processes as Jewish diseases. I've written in the last 2 years, let's see if I can do that. Yeah, 2 books. One was just mentioned, Doc or Quack, Science and Anti-Science in Modern Medicine, which came out last year. And on the 1st of May, a book called Anti-Semitisms. Doc or Quack has a long chapter on Jews and ulcers, and Anti-Semitism has a long chapter on Jews and cardiac disease. What I want to do today is, in a sense, talk a little bit about the origins of these debates in the origins of scientific medicine, which begin in the middle of the 19th, end of the 19th century, right? And in this moment, the question that is asked by everyone is, are the Jews a diseased people? Now, the Jews is a category which has huge problems, because are we talking about an ethnic community? Are we talking about a religious community? And we'll see that we are also simultaneously at the 19th century talking about a biological or a racial community. Medical commonplaces of the age of scientific medicine assumed the predisposition of this collective, the Jews, for specific forms of illness, from cardiovascular disease, which I talk about in my book on anti-Semitisms, to ulcers, which I talk about in my book on docs and quacks, and beyond. The thing that you have to understand is that this is both official medical belief. The standard medical textbooks of the time repeated this view in various contexts, including those which associated the hidden taint of the Jews' potential for illness with visible signs of degeneracy. And degeneracy becomes the big category for talking about Jews in the 19th century. And perhaps we can go to one of the founders of modern Zionism, Max Nordau, in his global bestseller, Degeneration, of the year 1892. This is, by the way, Nordau before he becomes a Zionist. And he defines it in a way that is absolutely, both in terms of popular culture as well as medical culture, the sort of baseline. Degeneracy for Nordau is a morbid deviation from an original type. This deviation, even if at the outset is ever so slight, contained transmissible elements of such a nature that anyone bearing in him the germs become more and more incapable of fulfilling his functions in the world. And we see that, and mental progress finds itself menaced also in his descendants. That is, it takes a little deviation from the healthy, from the norm, right? In each generation, it gets worse, right? And that's the kind of basic belief of the inheritance of negative qualities in the 19th century, which is called degeneration. Now, I want to use mental illness as a kind of test case. And it's a test case because, on the one hand, it's invisible, right? The mentally ill, you cannot see it on their bodies. But degenerates had to be seen. In 1912, Georg Burgel's Handbook of Forensic Medicine, dealing with the disease of hysteria, states quite clearly that the Jewish race has a special predisposition for hysteria. For him, this is the result of the degenerative nature of the Jew, and is also marked, and this is where it gets interesting, it's always visible. You can always see the Jew. You can always see the disease of the Jew. It's marked by physical signs of degeneration, such as asymmetry and malocclusion of the skull, malocclusion of the teeth, etc. The visibility of the Jew was identical to the visibility of the degenerate. There are signs and symptoms pointing to their susceptibility. But what gets interesting is what causes it. In Paris, the greatest neurologist of the time, Jean-Martin Charcot, every Tuesday he would have a public lecture, and everybody in Paris would come to hear these lectures. And in October of 1888, he notes that the Jews are the best source of material for the study of nervous illness. The explanation is easy. And why? Because of the intermarriage of the Jews. Now, this is interesting. Jews are ill because of their consanguineous marriage, endogenous marriage, marriage within the group, because the 19th century thought understood this to be a form of incest. And all of you believe that, right? Why don't first cousins marry? Because there's going to be biological deficits, degeneracy. But Charcot's opposition is because he's a liberal. He doesn't like religion. He doesn't like Jewish marriage practices. He doesn't like the Catholic Church. He throws the nursing nuns, for example, out of his hospital at the Salpêtrière. So the cause for Charcot is indeed biological, but its origin is in religious practice. In Vienna, Richard Kraft-Ebing says that they're at risk for diseases of the central nervous system, such as neurasthenia, which is the big disease of the late 19th century, the lack of nerve force, sometimes, by the way, called the American disease, because the Jewish male is an overachiever in the arena of commerce or politics, who reads reports and business correspondence, start market notations during meals, for whom time is money, right? They use too much of their brain in a restless striving for profit, right? In other words, they miss the point of living in the world because striving for profit accounts for their higher percentage of mental and nervous ailments. And by the way, also for their ulcers. Therefore, a certain tendency for mental illness must reside in the race. And you know this stereotype of the Jew always wanting everything to be reduced to profit. The first president of the German Association of Neurologists, Wilhelm Erb, in 1903, notes that the Semites, who are already a neurotically predisposed race, their untamed desire for profit and their nervousness, right? Now, you're hearing all these echoes. Why? Because of imposed lifestyle, withdrawing within the group, as well as inbreeding, and he uses the word incest, insult, and marriage within family predisposes them to nervousness. In other words, he says everything that everybody has been saying, but he says that this is a specific problem of the Jews, right? The dean of Vierde Sekte, German psychiatrist, Emmeline Kraepelin, whose Institute of Psychiatry still exists in Munich, by the way, the father of what today we call organic society, argues that there's a trigger. And remember, there's always going to be a discussion if you've got biological predisposition of why not everybody in the group presents with these illnesses, right? There has to be a trigger. And his argument is the Jews have all this problem of underpinning of degeneracy, but it's the domestication of the Jews, their introduction into urban industrial society, their isolation from nature, and their exposure to the stresses of modern life, to steam locomotives, to factories, to big cities, to electricity, that causes their degeneration. In Berlin, after World War I, Karl Bonhoeffer, the father of the theologian, in 1926 defines, looking at mental illness after World War I, diseases such as traumatic neurosis. We would talk today about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, after World War I, shell shock, right? He says that traumatic neurosis among Jews is the result of a pre-existing hereditary endogenous disposition, right? The Jews, when they become soldiers or get traumatized, they have traumatic neurosis because they have a pre-existing hereditary tradition. But what's the trigger? The trigger was the availability of compensation. The law is the cause of traumatic neurosis. The disorder was caused by secondary gain, a compensation neurosis. They can get money from the state for their shell shock. Now, we've seen this debate about the illnesses of the Jews defined indeed by their desire for economic advantage. We know it's an ancient claim going back to debates, by the way, both in Christianity and in Islam, right, about whether or not money can reproduce. That's an interesting question. And Jews are said to be able to deal with inanimate objects which can reproduce, in other words, freaks of nature. Now, there are interesting alternatives at exactly this moment, and we're seeing this back today on the right wing and the left wing with the rise of anti-Semitisms, with the rise of the notion of the decline of peoples, natalism. The British are dying out, the Americans are dying out, right? In 1883, after the death of his second cousin, Charles Darwin, Francis Galton gives his research in human selection a name, eugenics. And he talks about positive eugenics, meaning getting all the good people to reproduce and make children, and stopping the bad, degenerate people from reproducing and having children. Same thing today, by the way, exactly the same arguments today. But in 1910, shortly before his death, the Jewish Chronicle goes to him and says, well, what about the Jews? And he says, look, I love Jewish religion. It is a praiseworthy feature of the Jewish religion that as a religion, it enjoins the multiplication of the human species, have lots of children. By the way, interesting that that's true in the East End, right? Not elsewhere, right? But it is still more important, he says, to determine that the children shall be born from the fit and not the unfit, right? Positive eugenics and negative eugenics. But he also makes an argument, by the way, which his contemporary Friedrich Nietzsche makes in 1888, that there is the survival of the fittest. That is, the great pogroms in Europe, starting with the assassination of the Tsar in the 1880s, has wiped out all the weak ones. So far as persecution weeds out those who are unfit, it tends to evolve a race suited to meet hard conditions. Nietzsche says the Jews are the hardiest nation. And this is, of course, the fantasy that only the weak people are killed in the pogroms, in the Holocaust, right? That there's a kind of purpose to the Holocaust. There's a purpose to pogrom. There isn't, by the way. There isn't. It's random. Now, all of this takes place. It all sounds like Looney Tunes, right? It all sounds Looney Tunes. Exactly at the moment of the rise of genetics. We're talking about eugenics, but as you remember from your school days, Gregor Mendel in 1866 and 1868 publishes two essays which no one reads on sweet peas, right? Are they short? Are they tall? Are they pink? Are they blue? He's interested in variations in phenotypes, the observable physical characteristics of an organism. You got to see it, right? Or are due to the variations of a genotype or the organism's particular set of genes. He didn't know from genes, right? Each of which specifies a particularly visible trait. Now, what's really important is we've been talking from this period from the 1880s through the 1920s. This is the moment of the beginning of modern genetics. In 1900, Mendel's work is rediscovered by three major scientists, Hugo de Vries, Karl Correns, and Ernst von Scherke. At this moment, from 1900 through the 1930s, there is virtually no distinction between genetics and eugenics. Genetics is used to provide evidence for eugenic arguments, and it's only as the politics in the 1920s and 30s start to force people to ask whether those are the questions genetics wants to ask, that geneticists start to stop talking about people. They continue to talk people in Germany and the United States all the time, but some of them start to talk about fruit flies, right? There's no politics of fruit fly genetics. So one of the things we have to understand is that modern genetics and modern eugenics were and have again become linked in the last few decades. Now, if you were a doc, whether Jewish or non-Jewish, you had to subscribe to this stuff. You had no choice. If you wanted to join the club, you had to believe in the theory. Now, the greatest doctor of the time, right, in the world is William Osler, is a Canadian who becomes one of the founding fathers of the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. He's the first physician in chief, and then becomes the senior physician at Oxford. He's been a student in Berlin in the 1870s. In 1884, as a young doc, he returns. And now he sees what's happening to Jewish doctors and why they have to subscribe. He says the modern hep, 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 yelled in the streets by anti-Semite-sounding Jews, shrieked in Berlin for some times past, has no means died out. I hope to be able to get the data with reference to the exact numbers of professors and docents of Hebrew extraction in the German medical faculties. The number is very great, he says. And of those I know, their positions have been won by hard and honorable work. But I fear that, as I hear that has already been the case, the present agitation will help to make the attainment of university professors additionally difficult. One cannot notice here in any assembly of doctors the strong Semitic element. At the local medical societies, and at the congresses of physicians, it was particularly noticeable. And the same holds good in any conditions. And he concludes, all honor to them. But he understands you gotta play by the science rules in which you're trained. So in Milan, Cesare Lombroso, who is professor of forensic psychiatry, and whose name is linked to the concept of degeneration. He's one of the people who starts to talk about criminals as degenerates, about prostitutes as degenerates. All of a sudden, this is his big claim to fame. His fellow non-Jewish scientists are saying, but hey, the Jews are all degenerate. We have all this evidence. And in 1893, he writes a book, right? And the book is called Anti-Semitism and the Jews in the Light of Modern Science. Now, the thing you've got to understand is he accepts the data. He accepts the notion that Jews are more ill, more crazy, more unable to function in modern society than non-Jews. He quotes Jean-Martin Charcot to that end. But his explanation is the residual effect of persecution on Jews in Western Europe, on Jews in Eastern Europe who are flooding into Western Europe, just as people are flooding from North Africa into Europe today. Today, we use the term weathering for this, by the way. So this is not a concept that has gone away, talking about Jews and mental illness. But there's a cure, and that cure is Zionism. Zionism cures Jewish diseases. Herzl has a theory of what's going to happen to these sick, pathetic Jews in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe and in England and in the United States. He says education can be achieved only through shock treatment. Charles Darwin's theory of imitation will be validated. The Jews will adapt. They are like seals that have been thrown back into the water by an accident of nature. If they return to dry land, if they have a national state and manage to stay there for a few generations, their fins will change back into legs. They will become healthy again. And Max Nodau, now in his great Zionist zeal, writes in 1903, the Zionists teach the Jews to hold their heads high, to be proud of their descent, and to despise the anti-Semitic lies. They care in the measure of their strength for the amelioration of the hygiene of the Jewish proletariat, for make them healthy, for its economic improvement by means of association and solidarity. Most Jews are very poor. For well-directed education of children, for the instruction of women. They preach the duty of leading a faultless spiritual life, not religious life. The rejection of crude materialism into which the assimilation Jews, on account of the want of a worthy ideal, are only too apt to sink, and strict control in word and deed. And this is the cue. They found athletic societies in order to promote the long-neglected physical development of the rising generation. My grandfather, who came from Belarus, right, came from the Pavlovich settlement, broke horses for a living. He was as strong as an ox. He could lift a horse himself. But the fantasy is of these weak, pathetic sect Jews. In Palestine in 1940, the German Zionist Elias Auerbach pinpoints what the problem is. He says the multitudinous signs of disease which have long been attributed to the Jews because of their racial identity or their inbreeding has been proven to be an artifact of their occupation, right? Not who they are, but what they do. And this is this great fantasy. It's Wordsworth's fantasy in the age of industrialization. It's Tolstoy's fantasy at the end of the 19th century. If you are healthy, you have to be on the land. You have to be a farmer, one with the land. It defines 19th century nationalism in an age, of course, of industrialization, even, by the way, in Tsarist Russia. Martin Englander, in his pamphlet of 1902, dismisses the notion that neurasthenia, right, the American disease, is the result of inbreeding of the Jews. He says Americans are an example of a race, he uses that word, in which neurasthenia predominates. It is indeed the American disease, but in which exogenous marriages outside of the group are common. What causes Jews to be so sick, right? It's their confinement in the city, and the cure is land, air, light. Right? The healthy Jewish body, the perfect Jewish body, the Sabra, at least Ari ben Canaan, Paul Newman, half Jewish, I'll give you. In Exodus, the film in 1960, by the way, he's gorgeous. blue-eyed, the more beautiful Jew you can imagine. My friend Miriam Röhrer, the historian, writes that at this moment, the beginning of the 20th century, physical labor became part of a Jewish body politics with regard to the citizen, a Zionist citizen to be. The target group, those Zionists addressed with their call for productive physical labor. Remember what's written on the gate at Auschwitz. Arbeit macht frei. Work will liberate you. Was not so much non-Jewish society, even less the anti-Semites, but rather the religious Jews who then, like now, stuck to their books and religious practices in a quite condescending manner. They used to call them ghetto Jews in Palestine, in contrast to the new Chalutz, who had yet to be trained as a farmer, as having productive labor, not a doctor, not a lawyer, not a geneticist, a farmer. 2026, very different world in Israel. By 2000, the kibbutzim, the labor collectives that had one defined the chalutzim, had become tourist attractions, B&Bs. And the sabras, at least the women, were posing as IDF calendar pinups to be sold, mind you, not in Israel, but abroad. Israel in 2026 is the startup nation, inhabited by the sort of book-bound nerds whom Zionist reformers such as Max Nordau had wanted to turn into farmers. They were no longer Friedrich Nietzsche's and his cultural Zionist follower Achad Ha'am's blonde warriors, except in the fantasies of Jews beyond Israel's borders. In the secular diaspora, it was pretty much the same. The non-Jewish writer Thomas Mann in 1907, thinking about this transformation, talks about the replacement of the ghetto Jew, right, by with his humpback crooked legs and red gesticulating hands, by young people in Germany who have grown up with English sports, not German sports, cricket and rugby, certainly not fencing, for God's sake, and all of the advantages without denying their type, right, Jewish type, and with a degree of physical improvement. When Franz Rosenzweig, the great Jewish philosopher, visits one of the Maccabee Deutschland sports clubs, he notes on the wall there are signs in Hebrew stating Juvenal's great statement, right? Mens sana in corpore sana, a healthy mind and a healthy body. By the way, that's Rosenzweig in army uniform in 1914. He says the young men seem to know nothing about religious practice, even though they're really good at playing rugby. During the First World War, the new Jew on the front trained now for physical fitness, which exposed as lies the fairy tale of the bent and crooked Jews as our youth grows to maturity in good health and straight bodies. In other words, Jews had to look like everybody else, even if they looked like everybody else. And the minute you say that, you start to doubt your own bodies, right? In the United States, sports becomes again one of the ways of reforming Jewish bodies. Abraham Meyerson, after World War I, 1920, sports and plays form an incomparable avenue of discharge for nervous tension. They breed confidence in oneself, being extensor in their character. They allow for the rise of pride and courage. Circumstances excluded the Jew from their wholesome influence, and the children of the race grew up to be very serious, very earnest, too early devoted to mature efforts, excessively cerebral in their activities, and not sufficiently strenuous physically. In other words, the Jew, through his restrictions, was cheated out of his childhood. Not Zionism, but sports. Not the farm, but the baseball diamond, as Hank Greenberg, of course, attests. Now, the Galtonian moment exists also in the United States. Morris Fishburne, who is the leading public health scientist in New York City, a Jew, writes that the Jews are better adapted to city life and overcrowding by a long sojourn in the ghettos. Don't worry about playing. They've already fought their battles. They're going to be healthy because they can live in the slums in the East End. They can live in the slums in Manhattan and the Lower East Side because they've lived through the ghettos, and the ill ones have died already. A process of natural selection, as Galton said. There were eliminated most of those who were predisposed to disease, thus giving them an advantage. Now, are we going to talk about Jewish diseases? Are we going to talk about inheritance or experience, about nature or nurture? Maybe to avoid lumping at all is what we want to aim at, right? I'm going to stop at this point because I've made the argument, I hope, that talking about Jewish diseases inherent in some kind of imagined cohort, put the people in that cohort at real risk. Genetic testing is vital, but genetic testing should be looking at the individuals, not at the collectives. My push has been for all people, including people who self-identify as Jews, to undertake early genetic testing for me with neonates, right? So that we don't get into an interesting problem, which is one we have now, where genetic testing before marriage, like the old syphilis tests that were required before you got marriage license, is in the United States up through the 1960s. We had to get one. Are a kind of eugenics, right? A kind of making a determination between good and healthy and ill and diseased. Because all of us, Jew and non-Jew, have the potential to carry with us eventually things that will, maybe triggered, be defined in society as pathological. So I'll stop at that point. Open it for questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Gilman. Just wait for some questions you put in the chat. But in the meantime, I'd just like to mention as well that Jnetics are very much involved in a push to broaden what we do to a national program. It's still a long way away at the moment, but the NHS already offers some genomics programs, and there's a hope that in the future a carrier screening program similar to what we do will be offered nationwide. Part of Genomic England's programs is the generation study, in which they're trying to sequence the genomes of 100,000 newborns in order to gather data on potentially disease-risking genes. And programs like that are, in the age of large-scale DNA sequencing, really taking off. And at Jnetics, we're excited to see where that leads.
Absolutely.
Yes. My colleague Josh also wanted to stress the point as well that whilst we test people, we test as many Jewish people as possible. The tests are very much individual, and the results are only discussed between the participant and the genetic counselor, in order to allow them to make informed decisions about their personal choices. While we wait on potentially more questions, I had one question myself, which was maybe a selfish question from Jnetics, that how would you advise we talk to people about our tests without kind of implying the stigma about Jewish people being more diseased than others? Because obviously what we do isn't unique to the Jewish community. There are other ethnic groups with other conditions that are more common to them. What advice would you give to us to convey the importance of what we do without inferring the stigma that you mentioned?
Well, again, the problem is not so much what you are doing, because I'm a great fan of what you're doing. The problem is how then people start to talk about the Jews as a collective, right? So one of the problems that we have in the United States that you don't have explicitly with the NHS, but more and more people in, of course, the UK are having supplemental private health insurance, is the fact that pre-existing or potentially pre-existing conditions, right, will make it difficult for you to get health coverage. Now, once you start to say, well, Jews have these as specific to the group, then you start to ask these questions about whether or not the group as such is a disease cohort. And my anxiety about this from the get-go is that within the history of anti-Semitism, this has been a hammer to be used against the Jews in the most interesting ways. So I wrote a book called Smart Jews about the myth, and it is a myth, that the Jews, this collective, this lumping, is smarter than everybody else in the world. And that came out of a discussion in the 1980s and 90s about who the dumbest people are, and they tend to be in the United States labeled as African Americans. And the Jews, there was a book called The Bell Curve. The Jews were at the high end, and the African Americans at the low end. And it turns out there are a number of studies of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s proving genetically that Jews were smarter than everybody else as a compensation for their diseased bodies. All of a sudden, being smart doesn't look so good. So the answer is, I think what one wants to do is one wants to talk about genetic testing broadly. One wants to include in those tests, no matter what the community, the most frequent diseases, cystic fibrosis being among them, not particularly a Jewish disease, but obviously Jews also transmit cystic fibrosis. On the other hand, there are Jews that have very specific mutations. There's a disease, a genetic disease called Fanconi's anemia, that we literally can trace to a mutation in one person now about 8 generations ago who happens to be Jewish, right? So the answer is you want to think about this as persuading people, individuals, to have as early as possible broad genetic testing to make it available. We have commercial testing, but it is not inexpensive. And I agree that genetics is doing an amazing job in making it accessible to students, making accessible, one hopes, to parents for their newborns, because that's the kind of information that will enable you to have a sense of who you are in the world in terms of your genetic makeup. Not that you're going to always avoid things, right? But that you at least can have a sense of who you are, separate from thinking of this as a Jewish disease.
Fantastic. I think that's quite a nuanced answer that really will definitely help the way we put this across to people. We've got quite a lot of questions in the chat already, so I'm going to get on to one we've got from Lee Alon. And Lee asked, "Thank you so much for this talk. By prescribing interventions such as sports or Zionism, do you see these historical actors as promoting the idea that Jews were in fact genetically different or similar? They seem to be buying into the idea that Jews are different, weaker, etc. But at the same time, they also have the potential through non-biological intervention to be as strong as non-Jews."
Yeah, I mean, that's what's always interesting to me, because the bottom line of this discussion of the 19th century is that Jews are by definition different, right? Physically different. Whether that difference is because they breed within their group, or whether or not they can't deal with the stresses of modernity, or because they've got jobs in cities, but they're different. They're inherently different. But of course, everything I've just described matches on to other groups in the same society. So, for example, one of the arguments that Charcot makes, it's not just the Jews, it's the Catholics here in Paris. They do the same thing, right? They do the same thing. Galton makes the same argument about the Catholics, by the way. We are shocked because, of course, in London in the 1880s and 1890s, Catholics for him are the Irish, right? So the answer is, yeah, there's a kind of an assumption, but there's also an assumption that the bodies need to be reformed, and reformed means to make them look like normal people, right? Healthy people, right? Any of you who go to the gym every day have the same fantasy, right? In the end, your body's going to look like everybody else on this stationary bicycle. You know that's not going to happen. You know that's not going to happen. So that's why it gets interesting that it gets built into nationalism, right? So many years ago, I wrote a book about the Jewish flat feet. Why is it that in the 19th century, European scientists in France and in Germany and Austria and England become obsessed with the fact that Jews inherit flat feet? Because this is the moment at the end of the 19th century where you start to get rid of professional armies, in Austria, for example, and replace them by volunteer. We would use the term maybe today militias, right? In other words, everybody has to be in the army to be men have to be in the army in order to be real citizens. And if you got flat feet, you can't be in the army. And therefore, Jews can't be citizens. And that becomes a real argument. Narrigkeit, right? But a real argument. So when the Zionists move the Jews into their new world, they want to reform their bodies. Baron Hirsch did this by moving Jews to Argentina, by the way. So they all have bodies that look like gauchos in the 1880s and 1890s, right? So it's nothing new with the Zionists, but it's part of nationalism. It's part of this notion of reforming bodies. And it's, by the way, absolutely today true. If you follow the debates, specifically in Hebrew, in Israel, about why is it that the ultra-Orthodox don't serve in the IDF and the Sahal, right? The rabbis make arguments about that we're serving God through our prayers and everything else. The secular Jews, including the secular Jewish parties, maybe even the next prime minister, if Netanyahu ever disappears, make an argument that they're too weak to serve. They're too effeminate. It's really interesting. The word effeminate falls, right? So ain't nothing new about this problem of creating healthy bodies. We're back to it here too. The natalist argument, J.D. Vance, we have to have lots of healthy men to be soldiers in the army, and lots of healthy women to produce those healthy men to serve in the army. Absolute same rhetoric of eugenics from Galton in the 1890s.
Yes, it's so interesting how these themes come back in cycles, and or maybe never
Never go
disappear.
away.
Yeah, maybe disappeared. It's fascinating. Got another question here from Alan Stanton. The criteria for screening tests are well established, going back to Wilson and Junger in the 1960s. What sort of genetic tests do you feel meet those criteria? So we've got our own criteria at Jnetics, but I think we'd be interested to hear your thoughts as well.
For me, this is a really an interesting question because it's a movable goal. When I started dealing with this question, it was at the very beginning. There were very, very few tests. Obviously, we started with Huntington's disease, Huntington's chorea, right? Which was the easiest one to identify and the easiest one to localize. And because you could have histories in families. Remember that one of the criterion that we always go by with genetic testing, volunteer testing, right? Not mass testing, is whether or not there is a history of X in your family. If you've got 3 generations of breast cancers in your family, it's probably a good idea to get tested for BRCA1 and BRCA2 mutations. So one of the question is, well, what tests are available and how much do they cost? So what was in the beginning 1 or 2 tests are now dozens and now hundreds of tests. And as we get more and more tests, right, the notion that you may be able to do broad testing of all neonates, the equivalent, by the way, of now vaccinating for hepatitis B for all neonates, right? Um, which will pick up a whole bunch of different things. Now, what tests you're using depends on what's available, what the system will provide for. That's the ideal. The reality is, my sense always has to do is with family history. If you're dealing with a family that already has had many infants die over years, you might think of that Tay-Sachs, testing for Tay-Sachs would make sense, right? By the way, one of the problems, and it is an interesting problem, is that Tay-Sachs is the first disease already before World War I that is described as being primarily in the Jewish community and became labeled in the 60s and 70s as a Jewish disease. And there were a whole set of really interesting cases of the ones that I knew of best were among the Cajuns in southwestern Louisiana, who had this horrible set of, the phrase was failure to thrive, infants who failed to thrive, and in families over decades. And it turns out the families were transmitting Tay-Sachs, but they were, Cajun, French Catholics. And so that notion that, by the way, the boundaries for these groups is always permeable, is something that I always take seriously. So that's a kind of a non-answer, because what it says is, as we can do more at lower prices, we should do more for everybody. If you can't do that, look at family histories.
Perfect. And I guess this question from Lionel would follow on to that point where you mentioned a few different groups, which was Lionel says many nations interbreed, so surely this flawed public theory would apply to other nations, not just us. Interesting that Jews alone are singled out. And I'd also add before that as well that we do know of other communities with elevated risks of diseases. Lots of other communities in the Amish community in America and in Germany, among others. And as well as why do you think Jews were singled out? My colleague would also like to know, or were Jews singled out as the Black community have suffered racism around being considered inferior, etc. Would you say it's a similar cause as to why Jews have been singled out in that way?
I think so. In other words, it's a way of saying that there's an inherent difference. By the way, the other side of that coin, which I find very interesting, is that African Americans are seen as being immune, right? There's primitives and they're healthy because they can work in the fields, right? But of course, we know one of the most widely studied genetically transmitted disease is sickle cell anemia, which, by the way, is not a Black disease. It's a disease of sub-Saharan Africa, but it's a disease that is now found globally, right? As my father says, you always know who your mother is. You're never sure who your dad is, right? So this is, of course, a way of documenting using biological scientific arguments, something that has nothing to do with science whatsoever, right? It's a perversion of science, but it's an effective perversion because we think it's real, right? And that strikes me as a kind of an important thing to think about, because that question of the permeability of groups is something that, again, racism doesn't like. Racism in the 19th century gets really excised about people passing, Jews getting nose jobs and looking like Germans, African Americans having too light skin, bleaching their skin maybe even to pass as white, right? That permeability is something that racism really doesn't like.
Yeah, it's fascinating how just a few additional layers can defeat these arguments that gain so much traction. And it's
Yeah.
yeah.
By the way, I can talk about the NHS. I lived for 25 years in Tower Hamlets. And Tower Hamlets, as you know, is primarily Asian. It's primarily Bangladeshi. My local clinic, wonderful clinic. I love the NHS, by the way. I live in the United States. I love the NHS. You can complain all you want. Um, had specialists in diabetes. I happen to have diabetes. It had specialists in diabetes because the diabetes rates of Bangladeshi, of South Asian Muslims, not of Hindus, is very, very high. But no one in London would talk about South Asian diseases the way they talk about Jewish diseases. In fact, you can imagine politically trying to do that, in London. But everybody knew that the reason that clinic had a really good diabetes nutritionist and specialists, right, was in point of fact the population towards Hamlets needed that specialization.
It is interesting that it's been something that's been going on for a long time, that has been um, targeted support for different communities based on the different needs of those communities medically, which is
Yeah.
something that we maybe think as something a bit futuristic and associated with new genomic studies, but has obviously been going on for a long time. We don't have any additional questions in the chat. I'm gonna give it a few more minutes to see if anyone else has any additional questions to ask. But in the meantime, was there anything you wanted to mention in your presentation that you didn't quite get around to?
Well, let me end with the way I began. I am very anxious about the phrase Jewish diseases. I am also an enormous advocate of genetic testing, right? Those are not contradictory moments because every human being has a genome. By definition, we're human because we have a genome, right? And in that genome can lurk a whole range of things that we should know about from the time we are born, right? But the fact that we label diseases as specific to groups that are by definition not uniform, and maybe we have to argue that every human being in that sense is unique, even every single Jew in that lump. I think we have to both be an advocate for genetic testing and anxious when people start to talk about Jewish diseases, because that can be very easily turned, as it was in the 19th century and the 20th century, as a weapon against people who are labeled as Jewish. So let me end as I began.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question that's just popped up into the chat right as you were finishing there, which again follows on from the point you were making just then, which is from Rebecca, and it says, "Are you saying your key concern with labeling diseases as Jewish is because of the broader social issues that politicize the concept?"
That's true of all diseases. The stigma associated with every single disease is real. Tuberculosis, mental illness, right? So when you start to label groups as diseased, you are stigmatizing them, right? And that stigma has a political purpose. Nothing is stigmatized unless you want to use that stigma for specific purposes, right? So the answer is yeah, that scares the hell out of me.
Absolutely. Well, a serious note, but an important one to end on. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Gilman, and thank you everyone for joining the call. Um, uh, we'd love you to join us for our next lecture, which will be on the 23rd of June, which will be on a very different topic. This talk will be a deep dive into Usher syndrome, a condition on our screening panel. We will hear from Emma Boswell, a powerful patient advocate who manages the Usher service for Deafblind UK, chairs the DBI Usher network, and has co-authored a newly published book, Usher Syndrome About Us by Us. And she will also be joined by Dr. Randa Lee, who currently works as a clinical trials research fellow in Moorfields Eye Hospital, investigating the use of experimental RNA therapy designed to slow or stop vision loss in people with Usher syndrome type 2A. Sign-ups will open shortly, and keep an eye out on your emails and also the Jnetics website for promotion of this event. I'd like to thank everyone who joined us tonight, and once again, thank you for Professor Gilman for giving the talk. We really appreciated it, and our audience seemed very engaged. Thank you.